Okay, so we've been through Native American lit, we've looked at colonial lit, and we have looked at revolutionary lit. And now it's time to take another step into the literary world of American lit, and we're going to look at American Romantic literature. And one thing that we need to understand is that Romantic literature is a name given to the schools of thought that value feeling and intuition over reason. If you think back to colonial literature, we talked about how the colonists were Puritans. They were focused on their religion mainly, and they were focused on talking about what was happening in that journey. So they used that plain language. They weren't focused on entertainment necessarily. The diaries and histories, they wrote about what was happening so they could make that clear to the people that followed them. And there wasn't a concern about the individual necessarily as much. You know, if you think about the Puritan world, for instance, survival comes from working together. The individual doesn't matter as much. And so those feelings and that intuition over reason didn't really make sense for them. And then we had revolutionary lit. And the revolutionary lit focused on the revolution, of course. And those authors were very focused on the here and now, that they weren't concerned about anything beyond dealing with what was going on with the revolution. And so that focus on reality was very, very important. And you have that focus on reason. You know, we talked about how they were rationalists, they were logical, that they worked that way. There's a couple of other things to keep in mind with American Romantic literature. First of all, you'll notice I just brought up the picture of Love Sucks with Cupid with an arrow in its back. Don't think that American Romantic literature is how we think of romance now, where it's about love. You know, it's not a Nicholas Sparks movie or anything like that we're going to be working through. That doesn't mean love can't exist. It just doesn't mean that love is the main focus, like sometimes when we think of romance. That's the idea we have. A better image to think about this might be the image down here that deals with nature. Nature plays a very large role in Romantic literature in this time period, and we need to understand why. So as always, be thinking about how history and literature play off of each other, especially how literature responds to what is happening in history. And in this time period, worldwide, there is a major movement that's going on that affects the way this literature develops. And that movement is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution brings with it, as all movements do, some positives and some negatives, and that really affects the way people look at the world, and it affects the way people write about the world. So to begin with, let's think about some positives. Some positives are time. You know, with automation, with mechanical improvements, people usually get more time. And that idea of having time to just spend leisurely changes the world, changes America in many ways. There are people who went from worrying about the founding of the nation and worrying about survival to suddenly having some time where they have their basic needs met and they can think about entertainment. They can think about other aspects of their being than just the basic survival. And so that's one of the really positive aspects of the Industrial Revolution. But there are some negatives as well, and that's one thing about Romantic lit, is that it's a reaction to the Industrial Revolution more than an embracing of it. And with the Industrial Revolution, you can see these images. The first one is, I believe, an image of London. And this is where the Romantic movement worldwide begins, is over in England. This shows the smog and the dirt and the terrible pollution that occurs because of this ramped up industrialization that occurs. So the once beautiful landscape changes a little bit. It develops the dirt and the grime that comes along with it, with the revolution. Here you also have very, very tough working conditions for people. Obviously the child labor laws weren't in place at that point, so if your parents needed money, you could work there. And then finally, I like this image quite a bit. This doesn't come from the time period, obviously, but the loss of identity that comes with the Industrial Revolution is extremely important to the Romantics. The Romantic authors saw all of this going on, and while there were some positives, like I talked about, the negatives kind of overrode that, and so the Romantic writers decided they needed to do something about it. They needed to look at the world differently and take a different approach to what was going on. And so they do. And here are the characteristics we need to be thinking about. Just like with Romantic or Revolutionary Lit, and just like with Colonial Lit and Native American Lit, Romantic literature has its own set of characteristics. And so we need to be aware of what those characteristics are and how they work. These would be good to take down. There is a chance you will be tested over them. So the first characteristic is that imagination, spontaneity, individual feelings, and wild nature are all of greater importance than reason, logic, planning, and cultivation. Write down what you need to understand there to get a feel for this. You certainly don't have to take it word for word. But the idea of the imagination, that idea of the role of nature, you can see the child in the middle especially. If I can get my pointer on it here. The child in the middle, she has her nose pressed up against the glass, just having fun, just enjoying the day. And that whole idea of being spontaneous, doing something just at the spur of the moment is very interesting. And when we talk about that wild nature, again, think about what has happened to the cities during this time period in the 19th century. Untapped nature, undisturbed nature becomes very much appreciated. And so there's this backlash to reason and logic and planning and cultivation, and it comes through imagination, spontaneity, feelings, and nature. I often think about high school students, teenagers. They work on their gut versus the adults who work through reason and logic a lot of times. So this is really a time period and a movement for youth in my mind. So that's one characteristic. Second characteristic is that poetry, the art of poetry, is viewed as the highest form of the imagination. This idea of really tapping into imagination comes through so much differently in poetry than it does in anything else. And if you think about it, there aren't a lot of rules in poetry. We have that whole idea of rhyme and meter that we're used to with poetry, but you can really take it any direction you want. And we have some authors who do that. These are three of the very famous authors of the time. This is Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, two names that maybe you've heard somewhere, but this one you should know for sure, Edgar Allan Poe, one of the most famous authors of his time and someone who is still with us today in many ways. So poetry was very, very valued as reaching that pinnacle of what the goals of the Romantic artists were. Another characteristic is that the Romantics believed in the inner experience and the power of the imagination. So that whole idea of what's going on the inside is much more important than what's happening on the outside, which is a huge shift for literature, and for people actually. But again, think about that idea that our country is developing at a point where it's not about making it day to day. It's not about that survival. The history allows for people to think about what's going on the inside and really develop that imagination. And while these aren't from the time period itself, I think a Salvador Dali artwork really exemplifies this period. Another characteristic is that the individual matters for freedom and worth. again, before the group was the way to survive. The group was the way to create the new country. And now we have a time period where the individual can stand up. And so we have some examples here, again, from later works, but Norman Rockwell, his freedom of speech, freedom of religion paintings. And then you got little blue Nemo there swimming against the herd. And this individual. And I can't think of anything more individual than that. And the Romantics would really embrace this idea of the individual for freedom and worth. Another characteristic is that there's this desire to find true nature, uninhibited, untouched nature. Remember that this is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is polluting. It's ruining some very previously pristine areas. And so we're starting to see some changes there. And so the Romantics try to go back to nature. They try to get away from the noise and the pollution and the bustle that the Industrial Revolution has caused. And we'll talk about different authors who got involved in that as we go through this unit. But really remember that love of nature is a very important part of this movement. And finally, for this part of the webcast, this whole idea of desiring to avoid dull realities. They wanted to rise to a realm of higher truth. And so they did this in a couple of ways. One way was that the Romantics tried to create exotic settings. They looked at the supernatural realm. They developed the Gothic novel, Edgar Allan Poe certainly being very famous in that second part with the Gothic novel. Frankenstein was written during this time period as well. So this idea of the other world, this other place that we could turn to and look at, became a way to avoid the daily grind, if you want to think about it that way, and get away from it. So new settings were developed and explored as a way to get away. And there are some examples there of some otherworldly realms. And, of course, the famous American Gothic image kind of shifted on us there. The second way they tried to deal with the dull realities and get away with it was that they looked at the natural world for beauty and truth, and they would stare at it and try to figure out what they could get out of it. So one example is what you see here is the chambered nautilus. I chose this image because there's a poem by Oliver Wendell Holmes called The Chambered Nautilus, and he stares at this nautilus, and as he's looking at it, he comes to a conclusion about his own reality, about his own life, about his own soul, and everything else that goes along with it. And so it's a pretty interesting way of connecting to nature. If you think about years ago, there were those paintings. They just looked like abstract art, but if you stared long enough, a 3D image would come out of it. That's kind of how I think about the artists that turned to nature. It was a way for them to look at it until they came to some sort of truth. And so they really, again, turned to nature to understand what it could offer. And this is part 1, and we will get to part 2 on the next recording.